Under the heavy hush of twilight, the courthouse stood like a sentinel at the edge of town, its tall windows glowing faintly with the amber haze of fading sun. On the surface, it was nothing more than another day of arguments, documents, and verdicts. Yet beneath the solemn air, something quietly extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would stir not only the fate of the trial inside, but the hearts of two strangers who had never expected their lives to entwine. The benches were crowded with restless townspeople, the clatter of pens from journalists echoing against marble walls, and the low murmur of voices woven with tension. And then, through the echoing chamber doors, padded the sound of paws, gentle at first, but unmistakable. A stray dog entered with quiet determination, its ribs faintly visible beneath a dusty coat, eyes holding a strange intelligence. 3 sharp barks broke the weight of silence. No one in the room knew it yet, but those barks would set in motion a story far greater than justice alone, a story of love, of healing, of souls finding each other in the most unexpected way. Among the crowd, her eyes were the first to soften. She was young, though years of long nights spent over case files had left a quiet weariness in her gaze. Elaine, the prosecutor, carried herself with resilience, but also with an unspoken loneliness that clung like a shadow. When the dog's presence disrupted the room, she felt a ripple inside her chest, as if fate had brushed her shoulder. Across the aisle sat a man no one noticed at first. Henry, a retired locksmith with hands weathered from decades of shaping iron and steel. He had come not as part of the trial, but simply to observe, to pass another evening of solitude in the company of strangers. Yet when his gaze fell upon the stray, recognition sparked, faint but undeniable. His heart skipped, and for the first time in years he felt the quiet stir of something alive within him. The dog's collar glinted with a small rusted key, and whispers surged like restless waves. Elaine leaned forward, her lips parting slightly as the truth began to unfold before her sharp, compassionate eyes. This was not coincidence. She sensed it. The dog was a messenger, not just of evidence, but of destiny. Around her, the world seemed to hum with a secret rhythm, and though she kept her face steady, her heart trembled with the strange, soothing energy of what lay ahead. She did not know yet that the man sitting across from her, silent and contemplative, would soon step into her story like a missing chord in a song that had waited too long to be played. The judge's gavel struck wood. Voices rose in disbelief, and still, through the chaos, Elaine's thoughts lingered on the quiet stranger with solemn eyes. The key, the dog, the fragments of fate, all of it shimmered with mystery, but also with promise. Somewhere between justice and chance, love was quietly taking its first breath. The room carried tension, but in that very tension lay the seed of connection, one that would soon bloom into warmth strong enough to heal scars they had both carried far too long. Outside, the evening deepened, the air soft with the fragrance of wet earth and the healing hush of nightfall. Somewhere within that stillness, the threads of their lives began weaving together. What had started as a strange interruption was already transforming into something larger, something tender and unforgettable. And as their story prepared to unfold, let your heart linger here with theirs, because sometimes the most unexpected beginnings carry the sweetest healing. If you find this tale reaching gently into your soul, offering comfort and hope, let it be a sign. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice be part of this journey, and stay close with a like and a subscribe, so together we may walk through every chapter of love, fate, and quiet miracles. The courtroom would never forget the moment the dog barked 3 times, and neither would they, for this was not just a trial, it was the opening note of a love story. The key in the dog's collar was only the beginning. The night after the dog's sudden appearance in court seemed to carry an air of enchantment that clung to the town like mist. The streets were hushed, lanterns glowing softly in windows, as though the world itself had paused to breathe. Elaine walked home beneath the quiet rhythm of her heels against the cobblestones, her mind replaying the sound of the 3 barks, the gleam of the rusted key, the uneasy shift of the defendant, and the way her gaze had collided, however briefly, with the silent stranger across the courtroom. She could not explain why that moment lingered inside her, why her heart felt stirred by something she dared not name. It was as though fate had brushed its healing hand across her soul, whispering that she was no longer walking alone in the shadows she had grown accustomed to. Henry, meanwhile, sat on the edge of his bed that evening, his weathered hands resting on his knees, listening to the low creak of the farmhouse around him. He had returned home from the courthouse later than usual, yet sleep evaded him. He kept seeing the dog's eyes, steady, intelligent, filled with a strange purpose, and the delicate figure of the woman who had leaned forward with such determination in her gaze. She had reminded him of something he thought he had lost, the fire of belief, the warmth of someone who still carried light inside them, even when surrounded by darkness. For years he had lived quietly, hidden among his tools and routines, his heart wrapped in silence. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something inside him had cracked open, like a door left ajar, to let in a tender breath of healing air. The dog rested at the shelter that evening, unaware of the storm it had unleashed. The staff whispered about the trial, about the glimmer of the key, about destiny. But Justice, as they had named him, lay curled with a sigh, his heartbeat steady, his presence calm, as if he too understood that his part was not finished, that he was the bridge carrying souls toward one another, souls who needed to heal, to trust, to love again. Morning light brought a softness to Elaine's thoughts as she prepared for another day in court. She smoothed her hair back, gazing into the mirror, and for the first time in months she caught herself smiling without effort. She remembered the stranger's eyes, deep and steady, like the quiet of the earth after rain. She wondered who he was, what story he carried behind that guarded expression, and why her heart had felt a calmness, almost a healing warmth, when she noticed him. She brushed the thought away, but it returned like a gentle tide, persistent and unshakable. When the trial resumed, tension once again thickened the air. Yet amid the stern voices, the questions, the objections, Elaine found her gaze drifting, just for a heartbeat, to the back corner of the room where Henry now sat. Their eyes met, fleeting but undeniable. The world seemed to blur for that instant, the courthouse noise falling into silence. Her heart gave a quiet tremor, and he, though still and composed, felt a ripple run through him that broke years of loneliness. Neither spoke, yet something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a promise, a doorway into a future they had not dared to imagine. The dog's key had already begun to unravel the case, but in its wake it was also unlocking hearts. The courtroom became more than a place of law. It was turning into the stage where destiny gently wove 2 wounded lives together. As Elaine rose to speak, her voice clear and resolute, Henry's gaze lingered on her with quiet admiration, and though neither knew what tomorrow would bring, Both felt the first fragile threads of connection being woven, threads strong enough to bind sorrow into hope, loneliness into love, and silence into song. The day carried forward with revelations of evidence, sharp arguments, and the restless murmurs of the crowd. But within the undercurrent of it all, their bond deepened, subtle yet undeniable. And as the trial pressed on, as secrets stirred and shadows lengthened, the story of Justice the dog was no longer just about exposing the truth. It was about healing broken hearts, and about love that waited patiently at the edge of fate, ready to step forward when the moment was right. The storm within the courthouse grew heavier with each passing day, yet beneath its sharp edges, something tender was unfolding, quietly, steadily, like a secret melody neither Elaine nor Henry could resist. That morning, the dog, now resting in the shelter, yet remembered in every whisper of the trial, lingered in their thoughts like a symbol of destiny. Justice had carried more than a key. He had carried a thread that bound two souls together, weaving them into a story larger than either could have imagined. Elaine felt it each time she spoke with conviction before the jury, her voice resonating not just with the weight of evidence, but with a warmth she could not hide. Henry felt it each time his gaze found her across the room, her presence lighting a healing spark within him he thought long extinguished. Elaine had lived her life surrounded by sharp lines and rules. Her career demanded clarity, precision, control. Yet in the midst of the trial's chaos, she was discovering something different, something softer, unmeasured, unplanned. When she caught Henry watching her, his eyes steady and kind, her chest filled with an unfamiliar ache, a longing that reached beyond law and duty. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had endured storms and yet learned to stand firm. In that steadiness, she felt safe. In that silence, she heard the echo of her own heart. And every time their gazes brushed against each other, it felt like a balm, a healing whisper reminding her she was not alone. Henry, for his part, had long grown used to solitude. His farmhouse had been his refuge, his silence his companion. But now, each night after court, he found himself replaying her words, her gestures, the way determination softened into gentleness when she smiled. Elaine was unlike anyone he had known, sharp as a blade, yet tender in ways only someone who had suffered quietly could be. He thought of the hollowness he had carried for years, the grief he had buried beneath the rhythm of daily work, and how, somehow, her presence filled that emptiness with a quiet light. It was as though her very existence reminded him that healing was not only possible, but waiting for him, if only he dared to reach for it. The trial pressed forward with relentless weight. Hollis's defense fought desperately, throwing doubt upon evidence, twisting every truth into a shadow. But fate had a way of slipping through the cracks. More secrets unfolded, each pointing toward guilt, and with every revelation, the bond between Elaine and Henry grew stronger. They did not yet speak of it aloud, but their hearts were already learning the language of closeness, the lingering glance, the subtle nod of reassurance, the faint smile that said, "I see you. I understand. I am here." One afternoon, during a recess, the crowd spilled into the courtyard, their voices restless with speculation. Elaine stepped aside, seeking a quiet corner beneath the shade of an oak tree. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. She closed her eyes, letting the silence wash over her like a healing tide. And then she heard footsteps. slow, steady, unhurried. She opened her eyes, and Henry was there, standing with a hesitance that betrayed the strength of his frame. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply stood in the stillness, two strangers bound by more than coincidence. "You argued with such fire today," Henry said at last, his voice low, carrying the weight of sincerity. "It's rare to see someone fight with both truth and compassion." "It matters." His words struck deeper than he intended, and Elaine felt a warmth rise in her chest. She smiled, not the practiced smile of the courtroom, but something unguarded, fragile, real. "You watched," she replied softly. "It makes the fight easier knowing someone sees." She did not know why she said it, but she meant it. For all her strength, she had never realized how deeply she had longed for someone to notice, to stand quietly at her side, even in silence. Henry's gaze softened, and in that silence something passed between them, unspoken yet undeniable. The dog had brought the key, but fate was bringing something greater, the key to their hearts. When the trial resumed, Elaine returned to her seat with a steadiness she had not felt in years. Henry returned to his bench, his heart lighter, his solitude no longer suffocating, but gently shifting into something new. And as Justice's story continued to unfold, leading the court deeper into truth, so too did the story of two hearts, scarred, searching, slowly healing, draw nearer to one another. The barks had echoed like commands of fate. Now, beneath those echoes, love was beginning to bloom, and though shadows of doubt still lingered in the courtroom, the light between them promised something stronger, something enduring, waiting just beyond the storm. The rain arrived the following morning, soft at first, tapping against the courthouse windows like gentle fingers reminding everyone of the storm that lingered both outside and within. The trial had reached a fever pitch, each revelation sharpening the edges of truth. Yet amid the chaos, an unseen thread continued weaving Elaine and Henry closer. The sound of rain softened the atmosphere, bringing a healing hush that contrasted the fierce rhythm of voices inside. Elaine sat with her notes spread before her, yet her mind kept drifting toward the brief moment they had shared beneath the oak tree the day before, the quiet resonance of his words, the warmth in his gaze, the way silence between them had felt less like emptiness and more like comfort. Henry, too, had not forgotten. As he walked into the courtroom, the damp air clinging to his coat, he found his eyes searching instinctively for hers. She was already seated, poised, her expression calm and steady for the world to see. But when her gaze briefly lifted and met his, it was as though the rain itself ceased to matter. In that fleeting glance, there was reassurance, the kind of gentle, healing presence that makes one feel less alone, even amid turmoil. He carried that warmth with him as he settled into his seat, each drop of rain outside sounding less like sorrow and more like a quiet promise. The evidence continued to unfold, ledgers, photographs, testimonies, all of it tightening the circle around Hollis, who now looked more like a cornered animal than a man. Elaine's voice, firm yet compassionate, guided the jury through the labyrinth of deceit. Every word she spoke seemed to carry not only the weight of justice, but the subtle hum of her soul. Henry listened with an intensity he hadn't felt in years, as though her voice was a song written for him alone. He admired her courage, but it was more than admiration. It was the quiet stirring of love, the realization that her fire and tenderness had already begun to heal something inside him he thought beyond repair. During a recess, the corridors buzzed with hurried footsteps and murmurs. Elaine stepped aside, finding solace near the window where raindrops chased one another down the glass. She lifted her hand, tracing a droplet's path with absent-minded grace, her thoughts heavy yet softened by the rhythm of rain. She felt the presence before she heard him. Henry stood nearby, not too close, but close enough that she could feel the calm of him, steady as earth. "You hold yourself with such strength," he said, his voice quiet, almost swallowed by the patter outside. "But strength can be heavy. You don't always have to carry it alone." His words landed gently, like the rain itself, sinking into the cracks of her guarded heart. Elaine turned toward him, her eyes luminous, and for a moment the armor she wore each day loosened. "I don't remember the last time someone said that to me," she whispered, her voice fragile but honest. "I think I forgot what it feels like to be seen, not just as a prosecutor, but as a person." Henry's gaze deepened, steady and warm, and he inclined his head slightly. "You are more than your work. Anyone who really looks can see that." There was no embellishment, no effort to charm, only truth spoken with quiet reverence. It made her chest ache in the most healing way, a reminder that tenderness could exist even in the midst of storms. The moment lingered, unhurried, as though time itself had stepped back to let them breathe. And then the gavel called them both back to duty, breaking the stillness, but not the connection. They returned to the courtroom changed, as though something invisible now tied them together. As the afternoon wore on, the trial turned fiercer. Hollis's defense struck out desperately, introducing doubts, waving accusations, their words laced with venom. Yet, through it all, Elaine's composure remained. She spoke with a clarity that lit the room, her arguments infused with both reason and compassion. Henry's heart swelled with every word, pride blooming quietly inside him. He had never expected to feel this again, this hope, this stirring sense that life could still bring new beginnings, still mend broken places with threads of warmth and love. When court adjourned for the day, the rain had slowed, leaving the streets glistening like glass. Elaine stepped outside, inhaling the fresh scent of earth renewed. The sky was streaked with silver clouds, and the air held a promise of healing. Henry emerged moments later, and though neither had planned it, their steps aligned on the path away from the courthouse. Side by side, they walked in silence, not needing words, only the soft rhythm of their strides and the whisper of rain-soaked wind around them. The world, for all its chaos, seemed gentler in that moment. The trial was far from over, the shadows of truth still waiting to unfold. But between them something had already begun to bloom, quiet, tender, undeniable. Their story, like the rain, was not an end, but a cleansing, a beginning. And as they walked together into the soft evening light, both felt it deeply. Fate was not only bringing justice, it was bringing love. The following day dawned with a golden light spilling across the courthouse steps, as though the world itself wanted to soften the storm that had been building inside. The trial pressed forward, every word heavier, every testimony sharper, yet beneath it all, the quiet thread between Elaine and Henry grew more luminous. Neither had spoken of it aloud, but both felt it deeply. The sense that something healing was moving silently between them, drawing them closer with every heartbeat. Elaine, as she gathered her papers, found her thoughts drifting toward Henry before she could stop them. His presence, steady and unassuming, had become an anchor in the storm, a silent reassurance that she was not fighting alone. Inside, the trial carried its relentless rhythm. Hollis sat stiffly at the defense table, his polished exterior cracking more each day as damning evidence surfaced. Elaine's voice was calm, yet fierce, her arguments weaving a tapestry the jury could not ignore. Henry watched from his bench, his gaze fixed not on the defendant, but on her. He had never seen such quiet power before. Strength that did not seek to dominate, but to heal, to mend, to lift the truth into light. Every word she spoke reached into him like a balm, soothing the scars of his own past, reminding him that life, even in its harshest hours, could still carry beauty. During a recess, the corridors filled with restless murmurs once more. Elaine stepped out into the courtyard where the sun warmed the stones, and for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the light soak into her skin, the warmth settling like a promise of renewal. She heard the familiar rhythm of his steps before she saw him. Henry approached quietly, his expression hesitant, yet softened by something he could no longer hide. "You look like the sun itself approves of you," he said gently, his voice carrying that low timbre which made her heart feel both safe and unsteady at once. Elaine opened her eyes, smiling despite herself, the corners of her lips curving with a softness she rarely allowed others to see. "And you," she answered softly. "You always seem to arrive when I most need to breathe." Silence stretched between them, tender and unhurried, as though the world had decided to pause for their hearts to speak in ways words could not. Elaine studied his face, the lines carved by years of solitude and resilience, and found in them not just weariness, but quiet beauty. Henry, watching her, saw more than determination. He saw the fragility she tried to hide, the depth of her longing, and the fire of her compassion. They walked together along the edge of the courtyard, the sunlight painting everything in shades of gold. Henry spoke of his farm, of evenings where silence was his only companion, of the loneliness that had once felt endless. Elaine listened, her heart aching at the tenderness beneath his words. When she shared fragments of her own solitude, the long nights, the quiet ache of never truly being seen, he listened with the same reverence, as if her words were precious stones he wanted to hold carefully in his hands. By the time they returned to the courtroom, something unspoken had settled between them, not a declaration, but a quiet vow. They did not need to name it yet. The connection was already there, steady and sure, like roots beneath the soil waiting to bloom. As the afternoon unfolded, the defense struck hard, presenting a new angle, twisting fragments of truth into shadows. The tension inside grew thick, the jury shifting uneasily. But when Elaine rose to counter, her voice rang with clarity, unwavering, carrying not only the force of evidence but the warmth of her conviction. Henry's heart swelled as he watched her, pride, admiration, and something deeper, something healing, blooming inside him. He realized then that his solitude no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a season that was finally ending, making way for something new, something luminous. When the day's session closed, the courthouse emptied slowly, the evening sun bathing the world in a soft amber glow. Elaine descended the steps, her breath finally free, and found Henry waiting near the gate. He did not speak at first, only offered his hand, roughened by years of work, steady as the earth itself. She hesitated for only a moment before placing her own hand in his. The touch was simple, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. They walked together into the fading light, side by side, their shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. Around them, the world seemed quieter, gentler, as though it too wished to heal. The trial still loomed ahead, the shadows of truth yet to be fully revealed, but their hearts had already begun to open, blooming quietly, tenderly, into love. And as the night drew near, both knew without speaking, whatever storms still waited, they would not face them alone. The trial deepened like a river swelling after days of rain, its current pulling everyone into sharper truths and harsher revelations. Each testimony became another stone laid upon the defendant's shoulders, each piece of evidence another strand binding him inescapably to guilt. Yet, in the midst of this relentless storm, a different kind of current flowed quietly between Elaine and Henry, steady and healing, like a hidden spring beneath the surface. Their connection had grown with such natural ease that it felt inevitable, as though the 3 barks of the dog had not only cracked open the case, but also opened a doorway for 2 hearts that had waited too long to be seen. Elaine entered the courthouse that morning with a strange lightness in her step, though her expression remained calm for the world to read. She carried files, arguments, the weight of justice, but she also carried the memory of Henry's hand in hers, the warmth that lingered long after their walk the previous evening. That touch, simple yet profound, had reminded her of something she thought she had lost: the possibility of belonging. She felt it again when her eyes found him across the crowded room, seated quietly, his steady gaze resting on her as though she were the only reason he had come. In that gaze she discovered a strength greater than her own determination, a strength that was not about fighting alone, but about knowing she was no longer unseen. Henry sat silently, his hands folded in his lap, yet his heart stirred with every movement she made. He had thought his life was destined to be an endless pattern of solitude, but Elaine's presence had unraveled that certainty. Watching her stand before the jury, her voice calm yet vibrant, he felt something inside him mend. Her courage was more than evidence. It was a kind of healing song that soothed the cracks of his past. He admired her not only for her brilliance, but for the tenderness that flickered beneath her resolve, a tenderness that mirrored his own longing for connection. The day's proceedings grew fierce as the defense introduced a grainy video attempting to tarnish the dog's role. The room buzzed with doubt, whispers spreading like fire. For a moment, tension threatened to undo everything, but Elaine rose with quiet authority. She requested the unedited footage, uncovered the truth, and revealed to all that the dog had not been violent, but had protected a child in danger. Gasps filled the room, the tide of perception shifting back in her favor. Henry's chest swelled as he watched her reclaim the truth, her voice cutting through lies like light piercing through storm clouds. In that moment, he knew he was witnessing not only a skilled prosecutor, but the woman who had unknowingly begun to heal him, who had awakened in him the yearning to live fully again. When recess came, Elaine retreated into the quiet of the hallway, the weight of the confrontation pressing upon her shoulders. She leaned against the cool stone wall, her breath steady, but her heart aching from the strain. Then Henry appeared, stepping into the silence with the calm of a man who carried no urgency, only presence. He did not speak at first, only offered her a small gesture, a folded handkerchief, plain but clean, pressed gently into her hand. She looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unspoken gratitude, and for a moment the storm within her softened. "You hold the whole room together," Henry said quietly, his voice steady and low, "but you don't have to hold yourself alone." His words settled into her like healing rain. Elaine lowered her gaze to the handkerchief, then lifted her eyes back to his, finding there not pity but recognition, not admiration from afar, but companionship that asked for nothing, yet offered everything. "Why do you do this?" she whispered. "Why do you stay?" Henry's lips curved with the faintest smile. "Because when I look at you, I remember that hope is still worth believing in." His honesty was disarming, raw, yet it reached into her heart with a gentleness that left her breathless. She had spent years armoring herself against loneliness, but here, in the simplest of exchanges, she felt that armor dissolve. The gavel's call returned them to duty, but their silence carried more than words. When Elaine stepped back into the courtroom, her shoulders no longer carried the same weight. Henry returned to his seat, his gaze following her with quiet devotion, and though neither touched nor spoke again that day, the air between them was alive with something undeniable, something tender and healing, something already blooming into love. As evening fell and the trial adjourned, the courthouse emptied into streets painted gold by the sinking sun. Elaine lingered on the steps, her thoughts still racing, when she felt his presence beside her. He did not ask permission. He simply walked at her pace, their steps aligned as naturally as breath. The silence between them was not empty but full, humming with promise. And as the day faded into night, the weight of the trial gave way to something far more profound, the quiet certainty that love had already begun to weave itself into their story, strong enough to guide them through whatever shadows still remained. The air inside the courthouse had grown dense, charged with a mixture of anticipation and exhaustion, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The trial pressed forward into its most decisive phase, every testimony now a blade cutting closer to truth. Yet beneath the sharp edges of accusation and defense, another current pulsed steadily, the silent rhythm of two hearts, finding each other with each shared glance, each quiet moment that lingered longer than reason could explain. Elaine rose once more to present her argument, her presence commanding the room not with force but with grace. Her voice carried strength tempered with compassion, each word deliberate, woven with the warmth of conviction. She was no longer speaking only as a prosecutor. She was speaking as someone who believed with her whole being that truth had the power to heal. Henry, watching from his place, felt a quiet awe take hold of him. She stood there as though light itself had chosen her as its vessel, her courage unwavering, her gentleness undeniable. His heart tightened with something he could not fight, pride, admiration, and a love that was beginning to feel as natural as breathing. When the defense retaliated, producing old records meant to blur the lines of justice's role, doubt stirred like a restless wind. For a moment, unease crept through the jury, their expressions clouded. But Elaine did not falter. She countered with evidence uncovered only hours before, emails that revealed Hollis's cruelty, his betrayal not only of people but of the very animals he once used and discarded. Her voice cut through the shadows with clarity, and the room shifted once more, leaning back into light. The crowd murmured, the tension loosening, and Henry felt his chest swell with relief. She had not only defended the case, She had defended hope itself. During the afternoon recess, the corridors were alive with hurried voices, yet Elaine found her way to the same oak tree in the courtyard, as if the earth itself guided her there. She pressed her back against its bark, her eyes lifting to the branches that swayed gently in the breeze. The sunlight filtered through, warm and soft, resting on her shoulders like a tender hand. She closed her eyes, letting the moment soothe her, when the familiar rhythm of footsteps approached. She did not need to look to know it was him. Henry stopped a few steps away, his silence steady, his presence carrying the calm of a man who had weathered storms and learned to listen to the quiet in between. Elaine opened her eyes, and their gazes met, steady and unbroken. "You carry so much," Henry said gently, his voice low and healing, like the hush of rain against a window. "But I see the way you fight, and I want you to know it's not just your battle anymore." Her chest tightened, not with pain, but with the ache of recognition. She had spent years shouldering everything alone, believing strength meant silence. But in his words, she heard something she had forgotten existed. Partnership, a place to rest. Her lips curved into a fragile smile. "And you," she whispered, "you've given me something I didn't realize I was missing. Not just support, but the feeling that I'm not invisible anymore." The breeze lifted around them, carrying the scent of wet earth and blossoms, a gentle reminder that even after storms, life renews itself. Henry stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers, his expression steady yet tender. "You were never invisible," he said softly. "You've been shining all along. I only had to look." The space between them seemed to dissolve, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of two lives aligning. Elaine felt the tension in her chest ease, the long years of solitude softening, as if his presence had mended something she hadn't known was broken. In his gaze she saw not only affection, but a mirror of her own longing, for connection, for healing, for love. The gavel's echo called them back, yet their silence lingered, carrying more than words ever could. Back in the courtroom, Elaine stood taller, her voice clearer, her heart steadier. Henry sat once again in the audience, his gaze fixed on her, knowing he was watching not only a woman who fought for justice, but the woman who had quietly, without intention, begun to save him. As the session closed and the crowd spilled onto the steps, the evening light bathed the world in hues of gold and rose. Elaine paused, her breath catching as Henry joined her side, their steps aligning as naturally as before. No words were spoken, yet both felt it. The trial was reaching its climax, but their hearts were already weaving something larger, something healing and tender, something that promised to last long after verdicts were spoken and the courthouse lights went dark. The dog had carried a key that unlocked hidden truths, but fate had carried another key, one that was slowly opening the doors of their hearts. And as they walked together into the deepening glow of twilight, both knew they had already stepped across the threshold of something far greater than justice. They had stepped into love. The verdict came with the weight of silence, the kind of stillness that seemed to hold the world in suspension. The jury filed in, their faces solemn, their eyes carrying the burden of truth. Elaine stood, her hands steady, though her heart beat in rapid rhythm, each thud echoing in her ears. Henry, seated not far from her, held his breath, his gaze fixed on her as though the strength she carried was his own. The foreperson rose, unfolded the slip of paper, and with a voice that trembled but did not waver, declared Hollis guilty on all counts. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Then the air shifted, filling with whispers, gasps, the scraping of chairs as people turned toward one another in disbelief. The judge's gavel struck wood, sealing the moment, and Elaine felt the weight of months, of years, lift from her shoulders. Justice had been spoken. Yet in her heart she knew this moment was about more than law. It was about a healing that stretched deeper than verdicts, a truth that would ripple far beyond this room. Henry rose slowly, his breath catching as he watched her. There was pride in his gaze, but more than that, there was tenderness, a quiet adoration he could no longer conceal. Their eyes met across the noise, and in that instant it felt as though the world had dissolved, leaving only the two of them standing in the glow of something new. He moved toward her, steady and unhurried, and when he reached her side, he did not speak at first. Instead, he simply offered his hand. She took it without hesitation, her fingers sliding into his, the warmth of his touch a promise stronger than any words. They stepped outside together, leaving the courtroom behind. The evening light painted the sky in hues of rose and gold, a gentle breeze carrying the fragrance of wet earth and blossoms. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but all of it seemed distant, irrelevant. What mattered was the simple truth of their joined hands, the rhythm of their steps in harmony, the quiet certainty that they had found one another in the unlikeliest of places. Later, as the courthouse emptied and the town hummed with the news, Henry and Elaine walked toward the farm, where justice awaited with calm patience. The dog lifted his head as they approached, tail wagging faintly, eyes filled with the same steady wisdom that had guided him into that courtroom. Elaine knelt, wrapping her arms around him, her laughter breaking softly, beautifully, as tears touched her eyes. Henry watched, his heart swelling with a warmth that felt like sunlight after years of winter. The days that followed carried a new rhythm. Elaine found herself drawn to the quiet of Henry's farm, where silence was no longer loneliness, but peace, where the air was filled not with the weight of trials, but with the healing hum of crickets and the rustle of trees. Henry discovered that his solitude was no longer heavy. It was softened by her laughter, brightened by her presence, renewed by the gentle companionship of evenings shared. Together they tended the land, shared meals by the fire, and learned the language of love in simple gestures. Her hand brushing his as she passed him a cup, his quiet smile when she caught his gaze across the room. Justice became the heart of their home, a reminder of the extraordinary fate that had brought them together. Children from the village visited to hear his story, their eyes wide with wonder, their laughter carrying across the fields. Elaine often sat with them, her voice soft and warm as she recounted how courage could come in unexpected forms, how healing often arrived when one least expected it. Henry, watching from the porch, felt a peace settle over him that he had thought impossible. He realized he was no longer a man waiting for life to end. He was a man who had been given the gift of beginning again. On one golden evening, as the sun sank low, Elaine and Henry walked through the fields side by side, their hands brushing, their shoulders touching. The sky was painted in colors that seemed too vivid for this world, and in that light their hearts spoke the truth they had carried quietly for days. Henry stopped, turned to her, and with a voice roughened by emotion, yet steady with love, said, "You've healed more of me than I thought could ever be mended. Stay. Stay with me." Elaine's eyes shimmered, her smile soft yet certain, and she whispered back, "I was already yours the moment our eyes met." Their lips met in a kiss that was not hurried, not desperate, but gentle, filled with the warmth of two souls finding home in each other. It was a kiss of healing, of promise, of a love that had waited patiently and bloomed when the world least expected it. From that day forward, their lives unfolded not as two strangers, but as one story, woven by fate, bound by love, blessed by a stray dog who had carried the key not only to justice, but to their hearts. And so, dear reader, if this story has touched you, if it has warmed your soul, or reminded you that love can bloom even in the darkest storms, I invite you to let your heart speak. Leave a comment with your thoughts, share this moment of healing with others, and subscribe so we may journey together through more tales of love, hope, and the quiet miracles life has waiting. Your voice matters, your presence matters, and together we can keep alive the gentle truth that every soul deserves its chance to be seen, to be healed, and to be loved.